Hi everybody, my name's Ellie Holt and I am the Group Director of Assets at Notting Hill Genesis. I'm really excited today to be at an in-person event. If I had £1 for every net carbon zero webinar I've been invited to and attended, I'd be a very rich person and probably retiring. But I'm hoping today that being in person, we'll get a different perspective. We've got some fantastic speakers and I'm really excited they've all agreed to come and speak, covering a range of different topics. We're going to now hear from Will from the Carbon Trust. He has over 14 years experience as a low carbon energy consultant, and he leads the Trust's work with housing associations, helping them to develop carbon footprints and strategies for delivering net zero carbon. He's delivered research and analysis on the decarbonisation of buildings for the Climate Change Committee, for BEIS, the Scottish Government, the European Commission and the World Bank, and he's currently supporting the Welsh Government to develop a strategy for decarbonising heat. I'm going to hand over to you, Will, now. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you, Ellie. Thanks for that very nice introduction. Good afternoon, everybody. So I'm Will from the Carbon Trust. Ellie's asked me to kind of set the scene for this afternoon and this evening. Can everybody hear me okay at the back? And to talk about housing associations, net zero carbon, the challenges and opportunities. So in 15 minutes, I'm going to try my best. I thought it was good, especially with COP26 so close and coming up, to take a real step back and think about what historic point we're at in this kind of climate change journey. We're kind of just over halfway between 1990 and 2050, so we're really kind of in a crucial phase. For housing associations, 2050 is already in your kind of 30-year asset management plans. So yeah, we're at a kind of really key point. I was going to talk about some of these, but Ellie's video has done a much better job of outlining some of the impacts of climate change than I would. I just wanted to mention this quote from Boris last night at the UN. We will see desertification, drought, crop failure, and mass movements on humanity on a scale not seen before, which I think is quite interesting, just given how Boris was such a climate skeptic kind of 10 to 15 years ago, to see kind of some of the consensus that's emerging now across the whole of politics and internationally. So scientists agree that to avoid the very worst impacts of climate change, we should be trying to limit warming to below 1.5 degrees. Some of this slide is not appearing properly on there, but essentially what it's saying is that we're progressing very rapidly towards that point of 1.5 degrees. And current policies are insufficient to deliver us towards that 1.5 degree warming point. We're currently on, again, you can't actually see these projections, which is a bit of a shame, but we're currently on track to lead to much closer to 3-4 degrees of warming on current policies. So this is why COP26 really is so vital, to really consolidate action around 1.5 degrees, not just in terms of commitments to meeting it, but also the actions that we're going to take as a global economy to deliver that. This was quite an interesting just piece of analysis on the countries that currently have the targets and the policies that are compliant with 1.5 degrees. And actually the Gambia is the only country in the world that currently is on course for 1.5 degree climate change. The UK, to be fair, is actually in quite a close second. We have the national commitments compatible with 1.5. We don't yet have the level of policy detail and commitment to show how we're going to meet that. So bringing our attention kind of specifically to the UK has a target or legally binding commitment to deliver net zero carbon emissions by 2050, and crucially actually at least 68% of that cut has to come by 2030. That's again a legal commitment. So I think that just emphasises the scale of the challenge. We're talking about over 2/3 of emissions being reduced in around about the next 8 years. So hopefully that kind of brings home the scale of the challenge. And this is a right now challenge, not a 10 to 15 year time get started challenge. What do we mean by net zero carbon? It's kind of a phrase used a lot. If you like, gross zero carbon would mean that we don't emit any carbon anymore. Net zero carbon essentially means that we accept there will be some level of residual emissions in the economy, but we will balance those out with the removal of carbon from the atmosphere through different technologies. In the UK, that will involve a large level of bioenergy carbon capture and storage, which is incredibly difficult, but that's a whole other debate. I'm hoping you can kind of broadly see what these slides are doing. They're not quite coming up on here as they are on here. So I think you might kind of look at net zero carbon and think, well, that sounds okay. If there are bits that are too difficult to decarbonise, for example, in the housing stock, then we can offset that through planting trees or other. I think it's not quite as simple as that, unfortunately, for housing. So these are the Committee on Climate Change's projections for the built environment of where we will need to get to meet net zero carbon by 2050. And essentially for buildings, it is gross zero carbon. So there would be no carbon emissions from buildings in 2050 in any of the scenarios the Committee on Climate Change has set out. So net zero carbon, absolute zero carbon for housing, they're actually very similar. It's not just governments committing to net zero carbon. There's an increasing movement of organisations around the world committing to different targets. In the UK, over 230 local authorities have set targets for carbon reduction. Things like the Amazon-led Climate Pledge has attracted a lot of very big international corporations to be carbon neutral. And there's thousands who've set some form of carbon baseline and target. I think it's fair to say that there's a fair bit of confusion around the definitions of some of these targets, how the baseline is set, what the target would encompass, how much offsets are included. A group of organisations have come together to create what are now known as science-based targets, so the Science-Based Targets Initiative. So this is a bit of an attempt to bring some, if you like, logic and clarity and consistency to how footprints are done and how targets are done. And we're kind of very big fans and very involved in this at the Carbon Trust. And when we work with organisations to set targets, this is what we tend to follow. So what will net zero carbon mean for a housing association? We've done quite a lot of work with housing associations lately on their footprints. It'll probably come as no surprise that in the vast majority of them, the housing stock accounts for the vast majority of carbon emissions, the operational emissions from the housing stock, or downstream leased assets as they're technically known in the greenhouse gas protocol. We also find actually that for housing associations that are currently building a lot of houses, the embodied emissions from new build housing account for a very large proportion of that carbon footprint as well. I think to put it in perspective, if your new build rate was around 4 to 5% of your current existing stock, the embodied emissions from the construction would be larger probably than the emissions from operation of the stock. There's obviously kind of a lot else that goes into a carbon footprint, which I don't really have time to kind of go into here. One thing that tends to take a lot of people by surprise is the sheer extent of gas and electricity use in shared communal areas in blocks of flats, which you've obviously got a direct financial interest in reducing. So I was going to touch very briefly on ESG reporting. I think in the interest of time, I might kind of move on from this because I know there's kind of 2 or 3 presentations which will cover this in more depth. But yeah, so I'll just move on from that one. So we've talked a lot about targets. I wanted to kind of touch as much as I could really on what we actually need to do to achieve net zero in housing in particular. And there's a million things I could talk about here, but I'm going to focus on, I guess, what I regard to some extent as the holy trinity of housing decarbonisation, electrification of heat, flexibility of heat demand, and reduction of heat demand. And I think the first thing you might say is, well, why are all 3 of those focused on heat? Surely this is a much bigger issue than that. And that's completely right. It is a much bigger issue than that. But I think I wanted to emphasise the extent to which heat really will constitute the vast majority of your carbon footprint. It will do so now, and it will do so to an even greater extent as the electricity grid continues to decarbonise over time. So whilst there is a huge challenge out there across a wide range of issues, I think, as I only had time to focus on one, I think it's essential that heat is kind of up there as the main thing to focus on. Because of the decarbonisation of the electricity grid, we're at the point where Electric heating, so particularly efficient electric heating like heat pumps, has a lower, much lower CO2 footprint than a gas boiler at this point. I think the interesting thing is as well that as the grid decarbonises over time, that savings predicted to increase to the point where buildings using electric heating, hopefully by 2050, are essentially very, very close to zero carbon heating technologies. So yeah, I don't want to go on about kind of heat pumps too much. I know that we do as an industry perhaps, and I know that Alex is going to talk a lot about decarbonisation of heat as well. But yeah, I think it's just good to point out that the Committee on Climate Change in particular would see, if you like, heat pumps and electrification as the backbone of the decarbonisation of housing effort. There's going to be huge challenges in the electrification of heat, and not all of the answers are there yet, and the supply chain is not there yet to a certain extent. But this is the challenge that I think we all need to be grasping on. We did this research for the Mayor of London last year, looking at how you might install heat pumps, for example, in 15 representative buildings across London, which starts to unpack some of those issues. So this is where I get a tiny bit controversial. So can we wait for hydrogen? This is a question we get quite a lot. Electrification is going to be incredibly challenging and quite expensive. So there's a lot of speculation and hope, if you like, about the future gas grid being able to run on hydrogen, boilers being able to stay in properties and not having to take the electrification challenge. This is a very active area of debate, and I know that Alex is going to give you a slightly different kind of spin on this. I think where we are with it is that there are very major barriers to using hydrogen in heating. At this point, we would say that it's not part of a credible strategy for decarbonisation now to be relying on hydrogen for heat. I could talk for an hour on this, but maybe grab me afterwards if it's a particular interest of yours. How am I doing for time, Ellie? Okay. Yeah, that's great. So very quickly, with electrification, a huge counterpart of that, if you like, will be the need for flexibility. I think we're definitely entering an era in the electricity grid where when we use electricity will become much more important than how much we use. The time of use, the extent to which we can provide flexibility services to the grid are not currently part of a housing association's kind of skill set or knowledge base particularly. There's kind of a lot of good exceptions to that. But yeah, this will become increasingly important, I think. Things like utilising time of use tariffs, utilising things like hot water tanks with aggregation services that can provide flexibility back to the grid will be a major opportunity, I think, both to reduce tenant fuel bills, but also as a revenue stream for housing associations. And thermal fabric efficiency. I mean, everybody says fabric first. I've actually put it third here, but it is absolutely of paramount importance. I'm sure you all understand all of the reasons why fabric efficiency is essential, not least to hopefully try and protect people from the volatile gas and electricity prices that we're seeing right now. I think probably one of the only things that I'd say try and add to this debate is that to a certain extent, I think the problem of energy efficiency and the retrofit of the housing stock has been overstated in the sense that the Committee on Climate Change are actually looking at around a 16 to 22% reduction in energy demand. That's what they think will be necessary over the next 30 years to deliver a net zero carbon economy. So that's actually less than the reduction we've delivered since 1990. So that's something around 30% reduction we've already delivered in the energy efficiency of the stock. So there's a huge challenge out there, but it's absolutely not an unprecedented challenge. We've already come half of the way on that. I think the challenge will be not just about installing measures, but making sure those measures actually perform as they're supposed to. So this is a bit of an analysis of energy performance certificate ratings versus the actual energy use of those properties in operation. And you can see that there's not actually a great correlation between the EPC ratings and how much energy a property is actually using. And there's all kinds of reasons for this, not least the purpose of EPCs. But I think what this shows more than anything is that addressing the performance gap is going to become almost as important as the measures that we install, or more important, focusing on how buildings are performing in progress. This is a new build I visited just last week, and I think it's just kind of shocking that this kind of standard of insulation is still happening in a new build housing in 2021. Just kind of gaps all over the place. So I'm going to finish on just saying I couldn't finish this presentation without saying something about tenants. A home group survey last year found that 65% hadn't heard of the government's net zero target. I think it's fair to say that there's a lot of engagement still to do with tenants to bring them along on this journey. A lot of these changes will obviously be happening to their houses. But on a good note, so we worked with the Lancaster West estate in Kensington and Chelsea last year. And that project was absolutely, as you can imagine, Lancaster West is where Grenfell Tower was. The tenant engagement in that project was incredibly sensitive, incredibly well done by the team there. And also, it was very much a tenant-driven project. What they wanted was absolutely going to be paramount in that project. And they were the ones really driving the net zero carbon agenda in that project. So I think if the Lancaster West tenants are kind of driving that agenda with the history of that estate and things they've been through, then that bodes well, I think, for engaging tenants kind of everywhere in this journey and how much they'd get on board with it. All right. That was a lot for 15 minutes, but thank you.
Thank you very much. Will's happy to share the slides, so if you are interested, because I know some of the graphs didn't come out, so we can circulate those. Next, we're going to hear from Alex, and we did say there might be some controversy. So Alex has worked for Worcester Bosch since 1999, and he's worked in the Republic of Ireland launching new products, and more recently air source and ground source heat pumps, and he now works in London in the South East market. I'm going to hand over to you, Alex.
Thank you. Thanks, Ellie. Thanks very much for the invitation. Yeah, I'm probably going to look at an alternative conversation to what Will had, but obviously we've got to look at things very differently. Suddenly when in May 2019, when the CCC report came out, we've got to change our business massively when that came out with the commitment to net carbon zero by 2050. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our main core business, which is obviously gas boilers, but also looking at a solution for the infrastructure for gas. I just wondered, actually, can we put our hands up for people that have got gas heating in their homes now in the room? Okay, anyone all on electric? One. Anyone on LPG? Anyone on oil? Okay, so really, so that really just goes to show, really, within the room, we've got a massive change in regards to sort of where we go into the future. And I'm just going to skip over that a little bit. There's been a lot in the press, really, in regard to sort of banning gas boilers, which is obviously, we don't think really the media have done a very good job on that. We're getting telephone calls into our business saying, I've got to renew my gas boiler. I've only got 4 years left until 2025, the gas boiler. So really, that focus is just for new build, for banning gas boilers from 2025. But really, the education piece, really, and coming to us as a brand, trying to educate consumers to feel comfortable they're not going to be without heating and they're not going to be without gas. So we've been looking at, obviously, solutions for a number of years now, and we think that this is just one solution for where we can get to net zero carbon. So since 2016, we've been working with the then DEC, the now BEIS, to look at solutions for a scalable and economical option for decarbonising heat within the UK. We also want to highlight, really, there's a few little facts, really, is that the infrastructure in the UK has the best in the world on the gas infrastructure. We've got 280,000 kilometres of gas pipework throughout the UK. The actual asset of that is worth £40 billion. So there's a lot to let go of, really, in regards to sort of electrifying heat, and these are some of the tough decisions, really, that the government are making. Bringing it back to housing associations, local authority with residential property stock. These are what we need to know as a business, what direction that we're going. We can see that a lot of the properties, this is throughout the UK, not 10-year specific, by the way, but a lot are in Band D. You guys have an obligation to get into Band C or above by the year 2035, and hopefully we can give solutions for that, such as air source heat pumps, hybrid heat pumps. Certainly, from the high EPC rating, we're looking at potentially, a lot could go into the hybrid solution. So you've got a bit of gas and a bit of electric, very much like what a hybrid vehicle does. But just to highlight some of the challenges, and Will did mention this, and this is something that you guys within public sector housing have got to take into consideration. We've been very spoilt with gas, and the UK has been invested massively in terms of the infrastructure. With a little gas combination boiler, swap in, swap out, easy change. Whereas moving forward with the electrification of heat, we've got the main front runner of air source heat pumps, where you possibly will need to oversize the radiators, re-pipe work, you need an outdoor unit, another internal unit, and a cylinder. So these are the sort of discussions that you need to make with residents and also in consultation as well. As I mentioned, there was a lot of work since 2016. It's just blocked out there. This is the H21 Leeds City Gate project that the government wanted a substantial sized city in the UK that they could find a feasible way of putting in a transmission network fully on hydrogen. And obviously we've been working a lot on development of boilers since then, working with the DNOs as well and National Grid from an infrastructure perspective. Much to the point of some case studies. This is Spade Adam, RAF Spade Adam, MOD site in Cumbria, where NGN, Northern Gas Networks, are testing all the safety of hydrogen running through the pipework, underground, overground. The HSE are involved, and the government are being very cautious with this. There's other projects, such in Scotland and Fife and Leavenmouth, which is run by Cadent and SGN, looking at the safety of that as well. Government did mention it in the hydrogen strategy report about a month ago in regards to there's still safety cases to be explored with that, and we hopefully will get momentum on that. One of the main things really, and this is our 100% hydrogen ready boiler, 100% hydrogen running through it. You can see there on the interface there, it's got 80 degrees C, so you can touch radiators quite hot at 80 degrees C. I believe there's certain legislation coming out in Part L building regulations for heat pumps to limit that at 55 degrees. So really there's a behavioural change really in terms of cultural change from the tenant or even a consumer, homeowner, whoever, that they're not going to be touching a radiator that's going to be 80 degrees. They might dry their clothes on there or whatever, however they use the heating within the home, as opposed to a lower temperature. So all the legislation is to use less energy, and this is the considerations that we need to make on the technology type. There has been sanctioned the first hydrogen home within the UK. This is up in Gateshead. There is a Manufacturers' Day on the 13th of October, so it's not just boilers. This is gas cookers, gas fires as well. And you'll see that actually the gas cooker, they've used the colourant on hydrogen as orange. Anyone watch the Olympic Games? The actual Olympic flame and the Olympic cauldron was all powered by hydrogen. The Japanese are really pioneering. It was meant to be the sustainable games. They had hydrogen buses, and they really pioneered that. But so there is a facility in the UK here now that you can go and visit. There will be after November that will be open to the public, but we're trying to get a lot of people go there from industry and feedback and lobby the government. A lot of the work is being done in the north of England, and we believe that a lot of that is the reason because of the job creation side of things. I think there's a little bit of a north-south divide in regards to this topic as well, because obviously there's the controversial topic of Brexit and manufacturing in the northeast and the northwest as well. So there are partners, and you can see that in the reality. This is National Grid's roadmap, and you can see there, this was before the hydrogen strategy came out. In 2025, they've put in their hydrogen boilers to be mandatory by 2025. That's been suggested to be put back to 2026. In regards to the conversion, this is arguably history repeating itself. We've already gone through a conversion in our history, late 60s, early 70s. Towns gas had 50% hydrogen in it before we converted to the North Sea gas. And this is what we've projected. You can see here on the left, we're spoilt with gas. We've got to change. And we're in a technology transition. We as a business want to get feedback from you as clients and customers and what we need to invest more money into quality products for the future that will be better for the environment. And so we've very much taken a neutral approach across the technology agnostic approach, but we believe it's going to diversify depending on what type of property that you have and what area you live in. It might be a cluster of hydrogen, it might be your off gas, it might be your on gas, it might be your district heating. So there's going to be a wider, it's not just going to be gas is the silver bullet, it's not going to be any silver bullet anymore, and this is what we need to try and get a little bit knowledge on. And so, we think, the front runner probably is hydrogen, for the easy fix, swap for swap. There's a lot of work possibly to be done for air source heat pumps. I was on a webinar this morning with the London Borough. They've just converted a band E rated property to band A, and the full investment, including an air source heat pump, was £115,000, which is very commendable. It was an old Victorian, I think pre-1910 Victorian property, 4-bedroom end terrace, where they'd obviously put loads of technology in, including an air source heat pump, photovoltaics. And that's really where we can get that funding. What we want is something scalable and affordable and not be reliant on funding. So if you take the funding away, renewable heat incentives, all the other funding that is available, can that still survive in terms of that technology once you take that funding away? So there's many challenges. I'd say look at the technology type, look at the fabric, the age of the building, the fuel type choice. I haven't mentioned, I went with Octopus Energy 4 weeks ago. I'm buying my electric at 18 pence a kilowatt hour and my gas at 3.2 pence a kilowatt hour. So if I wanted a heat pump, I'd have to have like a coefficient of performance of 6 or 600% to even get the same fuel bills as my gas boiler. Of course, we're doing a lot of lobbying with the government, working together with the government, but also talking to a lot of people within the industry, because you guys, talking to MHCLG and BEIS, our main avenue is really with BEIS through the government. We had Rishi come to the factory looking at not just the hydrogen, but our solar panels, our heat pumps, or other solutions. So I want to remain agnostic, that we aren't, as much as we think that, we want the customers to have the right options, we want to remain agnostic across it. And even we've published a white paper in regards to trying to get a balanced approach and not rushing into something that arguably could increase complaints or put someone in fuel poverty or cause issues. And these are the new sort of technologies really moving forward where we think will dominate. Hydrogen, yes, it's going to be a while until that happens, so we've got to keep moving with heat pumps. What I failed to forget actually is that there is work being done on blended hydrogen into the main gas network, and our current boilers that will run off natural gas now will be able to cope with that. And if we did the whole of the UK, that would be the equivalent of taking 2.5 million cars off the road. So reduction of about 7 or 8% of carbon dioxide emissions. There's a lot of work from the DNOs to be done and National Grid, which we think could be an easy fix with existing infrastructure. And heat interface units, because the Committee of Climate Change say that 18% of all heating in the homes will be district heating into the future. And I just want finally just to say, we're proud of the fact that Bosch became carbon neutral at the end of 2020. So Will mentioned about embodied carbon. It's not just about what we call the tailpipe emissions, how efficient that boiler is, how efficient that heat pump is, how efficient that product is, but also how it's manufactured. And that's certainly our approach from Bosch, that we want to make sure it's ethically manufactured and We don't produce all this carbon dioxide into the environment and make a super efficient product. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Alex. Alex unfortunately won't be able to stay for the Q&A, but he has left his details, so if you have got further questions you can. He's also offered, if you want to go to the Worcester Bosch factory for a tour. I went, it was really interesting just from a factory perspective, let alone kind of the green agenda. So the details will be shared afterwards, so thank you. So we're going to hear a slightly different angle now, which is kind of the financial element. We're going to invite George Flynn up to talk about the evolution of sustainable finance and how this might influence investment decisions. George currently works for Natwest. He has 9 years experience and focuses on supporting clients across capital markets via the public bond or private placement market, as well as supporting a broader risk management and hedging strategy. So hopefully I've got that right. So I'd like you to come up. Thank you. Thanks.
Brilliant. No, thank you very much. So I suppose in my session today, as Ali's mentioned, just to take a slightly different angle, I wanted to touch on a few things in terms of the financial side. So firstly, touching on Natwest's approach from a sustainability perspective, kind of to set the scene. Then touching through different funding markets, seeing what we're seeing in terms of evolution of financing there, and then looking at sustainable reporting standards that we've already heard a little bit about, and framework evolution, which is kind of forming the cornerstone of that. And then at the end, just touch on a few tangible examples of NatWest support there. So if you've got magnifying glasses, you might be able to look at this slide. So I'll start off a little bit around the group, because we've done a lot of work in terms of our sustainable journey from our perspective, and climate is one of the 3 pillars of our purpose-led strategy at NatWest. And from our perspective, we do recognise it's a global issue. We recognise there's opportunities in terms of employment and other areas, but it really needs that collaborative effort to help act quickly, working in partnership to kind of really move that forward. And you can't really achieve that on your own. So I guess with that in mind, we've set ourselves some quite challenging targets. Make our own operations climate positive by 2025. We've already reached net carbon zero at the end of 2020. So that's the next stage in that journey is to go climate positive. At least half the impact of our financing activity by 2030, which is in alignment with the Paris Agreement from 2015. And then I suppose the third one is a bit more tangible in terms of financing. So that's provide 20 billion of additional capital that is sustainably badged or funding sustainable projects, whether that's carbon reduction, whether that's kind of affordable housing, whether that's green bonds, private placements, etc. But really kind of challenge ourselves on that side. And we initially set that target for 2022. In 2020, by the end of 2020, we actually reached 12 billion. So that we brought that forward to the end of this year. So really good story on that side. And then I suppose specifically for affordable housing, we've pledged another 3 billion of capital for the sector. And Headley is somewhere in the room is busy deploying that from a bank balance sheet perspective. I suppose, on the residential mortgage side, another target we've set is around reducing or having 50% of our mortgage book, by EPC C and above by 2030. And we've also launched a product that we were kind of discussing earlier, which is about a green mortgage. So that's really looking at incentives for clients to do the improvement works on their assets to get a marginal benefit in terms of pricing there. So, I suppose lastly, which is most importantly, COP26 is coming up in a couple of months' time. We're the principal banking sponsor of that. It's a really big event for us. And I suppose from our perspective, providing the financial aspect to that journey is really critical in terms of the journey to kind of the next stage in terms of the climate space. So talking about funding markets, I've kind of I'm going to touch on 3 markets, so loans, private placements and public bonds. I suppose in the loan market, specifically probably touching more on the sustainably linked side, we have seen quite a large proportion of increase in that space. And it's interesting how that's evolved. And previously, it's been a space where it's been mostly an environmental target that's been challenged. We've had much more scrutiny internally and hearing from other counterparties where we're doing syndicated facilities. around the the diligence around the KPIs that clients are selecting to make sure we really understand them. It's going beyond the day-to-day, and it's really stretching a target for the organisation on that side. I suppose the second one is, and this has actually come out through COVID as well, there's much more focus on social as well as the governance side. So thinking about different social and governance related KPIs that can be targeted and achieved is a really important phase on that side. And I suppose kind of the third limb is the LMA and how the LMA are approaching it. So the Loan Markets Association. I should apologise if I talk in acronyms. Then I'm terrible for that. So I can transcribe them later. Effectively, what the LMA have looked at is adding rigour and scrutiny into the assessment of sustainably linked loans, and changing the external verification to mandatory versus recommended, looking at kind of best practice guidelines on that side, and then very much again, aligning with the governance and social aspects, bringing those into the fore in terms of employee diversity, board representation, and other areas on that side. So, in conclusion, on the loan space, we really expect that to continue to develop, to continue to provide stretching targets on that side, and embed that within processes we're working on. I suppose on the public bond and private placement side, we've seen a significant amount of activity on that space. So if I think back to 2020, about 20% of housing association public bonds were sustainable, and that was actually one organisation. So Clarion did 2 bonds; they were both sustainable. So it was kind of a small proportion of the total issuance in the sector. This year alone, we've seen 10 sustainable benchmark bonds accounting for 85% of issuance. So an enormous increase that has really developed the sector enormously, and has actually kind of led to the evolution of finance frameworks, the evolution of targets, and effectively how, taking a step back, how that's looked at is housing associations will provide a public document, so a sustainable finance framework, which will set out the strategy of the organisation, targets they've got, and also how they're going to align the use of proceeds of that instrument to sustainable projects. And we might hear a little bit more on that a little bit later on. I guess one thing we're definitely seeing is investors looking very much more scrutiny at that with very much more scrutiny. So really challenging organisations, and it comes back to the comment earlier on 30-year business plans. Have you costed net zero carbon? Have you costed the kind of improvement aspect to EPC C and B aligned with your strategies? So really trying to get under the granular information there, particularly on gas as well. What is your strategy on gas? How are you adapting that to your assets, and really kind of getting into the weeds on that side. And that's exactly aligned to the investor base's own sustainability strategies, and many of them have got targets in terms of where they need to get to from a sustainable investment perspective as well. And finally, not forgetting the private placement market, this year we've seen about 80% of issuance that we've organised in the social housing space to be sustainable, mostly aligned to LMA principles, but certainly a really interesting development on that side, and an area we expect to continue to develop. So very quickly, I suppose, touching on a few other areas in terms of the sustainable reporting standards, a bit on structuring considerations, and a little bit on what we're seeing in terms of funds flows, which is really, really interesting from an investor community perspective. So the SRS was obviously a really important process, a very collaborative process last year, and really came from the fact that there were quite a number of investors that were very interested in sustainability and sending lots of different questionnaires to different organisations with completely different questions, but looking at a similar kind of strategy in terms of what they're trying to get at. So there was an element of inefficiency there, from a workload perspective, and a demand from investors to get more transparency from the sector and to really align those two areas together. So there was a working group that was formed that we were pleased to be a member of, to effectively review those questionnaires, thinking about aligning the standards with industry standards and frameworks there, and really collaborating with industry professionals from the investor community, from the housing association side, financial side, and investor side. And our role on that was to bring in as many investors as we could, because ultimately it would have been all very good to have a framework that was supported by the sector, but if investors weren't backing it, then it would have been kind of slightly pointless there. So 48 criteria were developed as part of this between core and enhanced, and we've already seen a number of organisations look at reporting this for the first time this year, and certainly kind of we expect that to continue to develop over time and be a dynamic document going forward. And interestingly, a number of counterparties, as I mentioned, the Sustainable Finance Framework side, have implemented the SRS reporting within their framework. So it kind of all blends together on that side very neatly there. I suppose then touching on sustainable structuring considerations, there's 5 points there just to briefly touch on. We are seeing clients looking at more holistic frameworks that cover a wide range of financing instruments. So that enables kind of access to multiple different investor sources, private placements, public bonds, loan markets. Intra or local authority deposits is the new one that I had the other day. So plenty of different options, but lots of different areas to really access sustainable capital from investors and banks on that side. And it's a minimum kind of additional expense, but maximises your reach there. Partner selection on these processes is pretty key, and by that I mean the second party opinion provider that provides an independent verification of your framework. They do vary, each organisation's got its different story, so it's really important to align that organisation with your kind of particular story there. But it's also important that they're a credible organisation for investors, otherwise it won't go down too well when you actually go to market. I've already mentioned the point on SRS and strategic alignment. I suppose on strategic alignment, it's very much taking a look at your own strategy document as an organisation and reflecting that within the broader framework and making sure that aligns with what investors want to see, even if it's a journey, because I think investors appreciate if there's not a day one fix, you need to articulate a journey to get to your kind of stated objectives. So, just really clearly articulating that is absolutely critical there. And I suppose we're seeing a really interesting trend of broader projects being integrated within frameworks now. So that could be placemaking, community investment, community support activities, which I think is really developing. And actually recently, I've talked a lot today about use of proceeds, so effectively pledging an equal proportion of the bond to sustainable projects, or green and social, which is typically green buildings and affordable housing in the social housing sector. But interestingly, we're seeing a KPI approach that the banks have slowly making its way into the bond market. So a couple of weeks ago, we had London and Quadrant, one of the largest associations in London, publish their framework, which has got some KPI linkage in there. So it'd be very interesting to see how that looks like going forward on that perspective. We're pleased to hear my last slide. Hopefully I'm keeping to time. So I just wanted to briefly touch on a few kind of key areas of support, from a Natwest perspective to try and kind of bring it to life a little bit. So we were involved heavily with ICMA in terms of the Climate Transition Finance Working Group, a really important project that helps provide future direction in terms of the ICMA kind of capital markets association future in terms of climate transition. A really good example of that in practice was a Cadence transition bond that we executed, where 100% of the proceeds were allocated to retrofit of gas transmission and distribution networks. So very interesting in terms of some of the aspects we've just been hearing about, and facilitating the integration of hydrogen and other low carbon gases, reducing methane leakage. So really interesting transaction, but aligned with that kind of transition finance group that we're a member of there. The second one is if you've got a very detailed microscope, the Natwest tombstone at the bottom there, which is our Natwest Group social housing bond. We were the first bank in the UK to actually put or try and link our financing activity on social housing to our financing activity from a treasury perspective. Effectively, how that's structured is it's €1 billion of capital, and we've identified a portfolio of loans that we've done in the last 18 months that to the sector for 75% of that notional, and for the 25% additional that will be lent to in the next 12 months going forward. And what that really does is show additionality, show that we're continuing to kind of push that boundary forward, and to really kind of show investors their capital is really being put to work in the future as well as in the past on that side. And I think the last one I just wanted to call out was around the work we've been doing on just transition, which I think is a really important point. So we were on the advisory committee for the Grantham Institute's Banking on a Just Transition, which is an enormously important initiative. And actually, we're now members of the successor Just Transition Alliance group. And that's effectively looking at fuel poverty, costs of decarbonisation, ensuring that there's a prioritisation for people who are, would struggle typically to afford that in society, and just making sure that that those customers are prioritised in terms of a just transition from an energy efficiency perspective and improvement side on that piece. One more actually to call out is the work we've recently announced actually in July. I promise this is the last point. Which is around Sustainable Homes and Buildings Coalition, which is with British Gas and Worcester Bosch and Shelter, and that's looking at improving buildings' energy efficiency, addressing key blockers to meeting net zero. And actually, the Citizens Advice Bureau is a member of that committee as well, acting as a strategic advisor as well. So again, the whole message I suppose here is finance is not something that one company can do in isolation, but is a key part of the solution, and it's really kind of generating those finance partnerships that will really help with the journey to net zero and a sustainable economy. So that is everything from me.
Thank you very much, George. And I think we're doing okay on time, roughly. So our next speaker is Bempe. She's the Financial Services Director at Notting Hill Genesis. And she's had a really exciting career in finance, working in finance systems, tax, financial ESG. She's also our lead on green finance. She's going to come and describe how our ESG report has been put together. She's going to provide a platform for where we can showcase our social purpose, our environmental activities and strong governance. So I'll welcome you up, Marmia.
Hi everyone, I'm Bempe, and today I'm just going to run through Notting Hill Genesis sustainability journey. I'm just going to briefly touch on the key drivers and what we've been doing and why we've been gone down this road. I'm going to talk about the Notting Hill Genesis activities, what we've been doing in our organisation. I'll talk to you as well about the challenges that we came up against whilst we were going through our sustainability journey, and also talk a bit around our future goals as well. So in terms of our sustainability journey, what are the key drivers that pushed us towards it? Well, the Future Home Standard requires that low carbon heat in all homes owned by housing associations from 2025. So that's given us an impetus to push towards having lower carbon heat in our homes. The government's clean growth strategy aims for maximum homes at EPCC by 2035, and again that's something that externally has factored into Notting Hill Genesis sustainability drive. Well, the UK government has also committed to net zero carbon by 2050, and again, with housing associations being organisations who own millions of homes, that's an area that is quite easy for them to say to us that we need to be taking steps towards that journey of sustainability. From an internal perspective, Notting Hill Genesis owns 66,000 homes. In the last financial year, our turnover was 900 million. And we have about a £4.5 billion balance sheet, as well as spending about 340 million on building new homes. We completed 1,400 new homes last year. What that means is that we've got a huge amount of money that we're spending on building new homes. And what that means is that we need to look at how can we make our homes more sustainable and cheaper for our residents to run. There's also, as George alluded to earlier, strong stakeholder interest from investors. We were told previous to our bond, which I'll come on to later, that the sustainability discount that you get is around about 3 to 5 basis points. When you think about basis points, 100 basis points is 1%. That doesn't sound that much, but when you're going to the bond markets and you're raising 250 million, 1 basis point movement is quite a substantial saving in terms of interest. And that obviously results in a lower cost of finance to organisations such as ourselves who are looking to maximise the amount of surplus that we make in each financial year. the NHG board also considers sustainability to be a key corporate priority. When we issued our corporate strategy at the beginning of this year, we mentioned in there that ESG, environmental, social and governance activities, were one of our key areas of focus for the next year. So, what has Notting Hill Genesis been doing in terms of sustainability? Well, we've been quite busy over the last year. George mentioned earlier sustainable finance frameworks, and we set up a sustainable finance framework earlier this year in advance of issuing our first bond. In that, we set out the use of our proceeds. Our proceeds we're going to be using for affordable homes, so building new social homes, new shared ownership homes, and then also using the proceeds to build properties that are at EPC, C and above, about 50-50 in terms of both of those. What that meant is that we were able to move quite swiftly from that into our establishing our sustainable MTN programme. That's medium-term note programme. And what that meant is we were able to issue a bond in June of this year for £250 million at an all-in cost of 2.08%. And that was just 100 basis points over the gilt. So it was quite a very, very cheap finance that we were able to access. And as I mentioned earlier, having that sustainability wrapper around the bond meant that we were able to secure those lower rates. We've also created a sustainability section on our website, so we now have an area that anybody who's interested in looking at what we're doing on sustainability can go into our website, look at our sustainable finance framework, they can look at our ESG report, which I'll come on to later. They can also have a look at the second party opinion, which George mentioned earlier. So we had a company called DNV, who are quite well known for providing second party opinions. We had them do our second party opinion to validate what we were putting into our sustainable finance framework. So that's externally available. We've also established a sustainability group across Notting Hill Genesis, and that's made up of colleagues from across finance, asset management, communications, corporate, housing. And so what it means that the whole organisation is joining together to make sure that sustainability runs through the whole organisation from the top down and from the bottom up all the way. I also just want to mention that we issued our inaugural ESG report in August of this year. And what we based that on was the Sustainability Reporting Standard, which has been mentioned in at least 2 presentations today. And what we did was we put together a report that told you what we do as an organisation from a social perspective, from the environmental side and the governance side, almost giving you the position that we are at now, so then we can build on that in future years. So that is available on our website. What kind of challenges did we come up against? Well, we knew that we wanted to go to the bond markets because as an organisation that is quite a substantial builder, we aim to build about 1,400 new units every year. We knew that we wanted to go to market this year, and having spoken to a number of banks previously, we knew that we wanted to have that sustainability wrapper around the finance that we were going for. What that meant is that there were time constraints, so we had to put together a plan for how exactly we were going to put together our sustainable finance framework and also our ESG report. We took stock of what was our current position. We understand that we have 66,000 units, but what do they look like? So we had to manoeuvre ourselves quite swiftly to look at our data and consider what do we need to do to our stock in order to get it up to the relevant standards. That was a data gathering exercise, which Ellie and her team did in an amazing job on, so thanks for that. And also we had to consider what available funding was there now. At Notting Hill Genesis, as I said, we spend hundreds of millions of pounds every single year, not only on building the new stock, but also on operational activities and keeping our stock maintained. We had to look at what kind of funding do we need, not just now, but also funding into the future and making sure that we stay within things like our covenant compliance and also making sure that we've got funds out into which links with our Treasury policy and things like that. We had to set ourselves some targets, so what kind of things do we want to do in terms of bringing our properties up to specific standards. And also, we had to think around the reputational risk. So if we went to market without having the sustainability wrapper, would we still be able to raise the type of finance that we were looking for? Would investors still be interested in companies that weren't sustainable? We also had to think about our peers. As you know, Clarion have been to market a few times. There's other organisations, Asda, Stonewater, a number of companies that have been going to market with a sustainability wrapper. If Notting Hill Genesis were to come forward without that sustainability wrapper, the risk would be that people would think that we weren't a sustainable organisation, when in fact these are the types of activities that we do as standard. As I said, this is something that we've been working on this year and even before this year, but it is an ongoing journey that we're still on now. So, as I said, we've got a number of future goals that we've already spoken about. We have about 66,000 homes, and about 12,000 of those we need to increase to EPCC, which we've committed to doing by 2030. We heard earlier from, I think it was Alex, who mentioned about the home that you've just done some sustainable work of around about 100,000 on a Victorian terrace. Notting Hill Genesis, our stock, we've got about 15% of our stock is Victorian, and that means that converts to around about 10,000 units that we have of Victorian stock. So if we were to do a similar exercise, you can imagine the level of investment that we would need to make in order to get all of our homes up onto completely net zero carbon. So that's one thing that we have to think about in terms of the investment to net zero carbon. What do we actually want to do, and where do we want to get to as an organisation? That's something that we're currently working on in terms of building our sustainability strategy, making sure that that's robust and also adequately funded, so that we can make sure that we can achieve the targets that we're looking to achieve. Out of that sustainability strategy will come an action plan. So we've recently appointed our new head of sustainability, and Laura will be talking to you shortly. And we'll be delivering that action plan throughout our organisation, not just through our assets team, but across the organisation we'll be doing that. And from the ESG perspective, as I said, we published our first ESG report in August of this year. That's something that we'll be looking to do annually, and also to be building on our ESG report. So reporting on different things, but also some of the same things. So you can look at our journey over the period of time from when we first started to when we finish, every year that we're publishing our ESG report. And basically that's just to give you a bit of a whistle-stop tour in terms of what we've been doing from a sustainability angle at Notting Hill Genesis. So thanks for that.
No worries. Thank you very much, Marmia. I want to say last, but by no means least, we've got our newly appointed Head of Sustainability, Laura Shellard. I think some of you may have been expecting Waleed Saeed, but given that it's Laura's new post, it felt more appropriate for her to come and talk. So Laura previously has been at Notting Hill Genesis for some time and was leading on our energy and heat networks. Her mission is to take forward some of the things that you've seen in Marmia's presentation. She's going to talk specifically today about what we plan to do on our homes, which is probably the biggest area that we need to tackle, as we've seen. So I'll hand over to you, Laura.
Thank you, Ellie. Well, it's really exciting to be here, and I think we've heard some really compelling messages actually about why we need to embrace sustainability and decarbonisation, why it's important for businesses, why it's good for our residents and staff. I'm going to talk a little bit about how an organisation like Notting Hill Genesis, that owns 66,000 properties, achieves the sort of enormous challenge, which is decarbonising our homes by 2050. And we can start to think about decarbonisation and sustainability in the context of 4 key business processes that we think will drive us forward on our sustainability journey. So that's planning, obviously the need to get control of a diverse range of different activities, integration, communication, which we've talked about quite a lot already with our residents and our staff, and finally partnerships. So planning, why do we need to plan? Well, the speakers have already probably made that point quite well. To get to net zero carbon, suddenly we're dealing with a huge range of different issues, different finance models and new finance models, technology, embedded carbon, sustainable materials. We can only do that with a plan. We know that most of the homes that we have will require multiple measures and a whole house retrofit approach. We might not be able to do that straight away, so we really need to understand the incremental approach, what that looks like, map it out, and understand really what the optimum journey is towards decarbonisation for our different homes. Where are we now? Well, the green line at the bottom is supposed to represent time. Like a lot of housing associations, actually, we focused on those simple, low-cost measures like cavity wall insulation and loft insulation that have typically quite short payback periods. And we've had some success in getting eco-funding to deliver improvements to our least energy-efficient homes. And we know that those funding pots have typically focused on those single measures. I would say that we're kind of moving towards this third phase now, where we know that actually to get to zero carbon, we're going to have to not only dramatically reduce the carbon emissions from homes, but also scale up that approach and radically scale it up. And this is the phase where we're understanding that actually we're going to have to address all these different issues that I've just talked about systematically through a really robust plan. And what we're doing is taking the ESG report that Marmia has talked about, which is a bit of a baseline, and then using that and the asset management strategy to develop much more detailed plans around actually how we're going to go about delivering or decarbonising our housing stock. And that will help us obviously understand all the different issues, how they interact, set priorities for ourselves and targets that will enable us to measure progress. And the really important thing with a plan is actually it enables us to be more holistic in terms of our approach, so we can start thinking about embedded carbon, waste, all those double wins with carbon. So we're trying to capture all the benefits of our sustainability journey. So next I'm going to talk about integration. Obviously we can't decarbonise our homes if we're not integrating decarbonisation and sustainability into our everyday activities and into our core operations. So a key part of that really has been making the target of getting to EPC-C for most of our homes by 2030 a key objective in our asset management strategy. So that's already in there. Another thing has been able to quantify the investment needed to get there, so we can actually include that in future investment plans. So we're looking at £30 million of additional spend to get to that target. And we've been able to do that through using systems or software like Chrome, which a lot of you might be familiar with, that enable us to understand the performance of individual homes and what types of measures are needed to get those homes to EPC-C and beyond that net zero. And we don't want Chrome to be a static report. We want it to be, we want this to be a sort of dynamic piece of software that we can use, and we're regularly updating it with information from our asset investment programs and from open register data like the EPC register and things like that. And that brings me on to the next point, which is about having really good visibility of our housing stock and how it performs. That's going to be so key in getting us to where we need to be. Having that really granular data to make those informed decisions about the types of measures that we need to install, but also what kind of skills and resources we need in our supply chain, because those two things correlate. And so as part of our asset investment strategy, we have committed to additional stock condition surveys and SAP surveys, and these aren't going to be just the traditional stock condition surveys. We want to actually have a surveying programme that is going to give us the right information so we can make decisions about what needs to go into our housing stock. The last but not least, what I would say on this integration challenge is that we are also talking to our supply chain now to understand how we can integrate energy improvements into our planned investment works, and we're also keen to understand how models like scientific that support local supply chains can really work for this decarbonisation journey. Engagement and communicating with residents and staff is going to be paramount, and I think Will touched on this really well in his presentation. Is something I'm quite passionate about, and I think the really exciting thing is that actually if we put residents at the heart of our approach and allow them to shape, the customer journey, actually you can get better buy-in, and that's going to be really crucial, bringing residents along on our sustainability journey. And we've, as a housing association, we're uniquely placed to do that. We've got the skills and capacity in-house already. Not only through the services we deliver as a HA, but also the fact that we're actively engaging residents around energy already through Green Doctor home visits and specific energy advice. And we know how to engage communities. We've got major regeneration schemes where we're delivering comprehensive packages of support that include training, employment, that have been really important during the pandemic. And we want to understand actually how we can take the successful elements of those approaches and apply them to our retrofit journey. And last but not least, I'm going to talk about partnerships, because the point's been labelled already. We're not going to get to net zero carbon by ourselves. We're going to need the right policy framework in place. We're going to need the supply chain there with the right skills and capacity. We can't solve these issues by ourselves. But there are already quite interesting, exciting platforms out there, like the G15 Decarbonisation group that we're part of, that is starting to explore these issues collaboratively. For example, what what should be the definition of net zero carbon? What is the common understanding of that? What are the different pathways to get to net zero carbon that will work for housing associations? How can we use our purchasing power collectively to support that growth in skills and capacity in the supply chain that we really need? So on that front, it's quite an exciting time. I'll just touch on the Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund as well, which we are looking at in conjunction with a number of local authorities at the moment. And we're hoping that that will give us the opportunity to explore these area-based approaches with partners and councils that are going to be really important in this, to see, what pilots work and what we can replicate sort of at an area-based level to really get that scale. So, on that note, what I would say that the solutions are out there, and we've heard, about the technological solutions as well. There are some huge challenges. We've still got that mountain to climb, particularly around how we communicate with residents and then getting that scale. I think the next key things for us, like the things that Marmia touched on, is actually getting those strategies and really good plans in place, forging ahead, getting that really good data and visibility of our housing stock, and continuing those good partnerships we have already with our supply chain and having those discussions. So that's it from me. Thank you very much.